for now, we're going to go ahead and move right into the fundamentals of exploitation to give you kind of a foundation in that, and then we will let you do some exploitation. So an exploit is a process or a list of instructions, or it could be an actual program that's used to influence the operating state of a system, and it takes advantage of there being an existing vulnerability, right? Now, in the world of exploit writing, you will also hear this referred to as a proof of concept, and it's often implemented in code. It could be in any language, essentially. Zero day or O day is a private exploit for a vulnerability that has not been disclosed to the software vendor or the general public. What do you do with it? If you have it, you can use it to compromise any vulnerable system before there's a patch for it. You can also sell it because security vendors will pay lots of money for good 0 days. And by good, I mean ones that don't crash stuff. And they're also against very highly distributed products. So the goal of any security researcher is to gather as much OD as possible. And it really does occur in a while, as there is a never-ending list of web application and browser 0-day vulnerabilities out there. Heartbleed is one. We'll actually have you do a Heartbleed lab, shell shock, and the list goes on and on. Right? So there's two reasons that exploits are possible. One is a technology reason and the other is a human reason. Okay. The technology reason, modern computers cannot distinguish data from instructions. They just can't do it. The processors at the processor level, they're not capable of doing that. Also, software is exploited when data is passed off as instructions. And if there's time, I'll do a buffer overflow demonstration. I'll show you how to write a buffer overflow exploit from beginning to end. And when I'm done with that demo, you will have a completely 100% clear and precise understanding of what a buffer overflow is. Even if you don't have a programming background, I'll do it in a way that it'll make sense to you. Now, why are the exploits possible? There is human reason, and then there's, software technology reasons. First of all, vulnerabilities are hard to discover in code. If you don't believe me, try doing a code audit against a coding project that's 100 million lines of code. It can get very, very tough, very fast. Also, we have the modularity of code and division of labor for large coding projects that keep this problem going even more, because you might have one piece of software that's written by 5 different software companies that have different SDLC processes, different security requirements, et cetera, and then you end up with a product that has gaps in it, security-wise at the end. This is a common, well-documented problem here. Right? So, if the vulnerabilities are discovered by a security researcher or malicious hacker and not released publicly, they can save it for pen tests, they can trade with others, they can sell it, they can, malicious hackers will just use it to get into high-profile targets until there's a patch for it or until it's discovered. It can also be used to hack into other people's computers that also have 0-day. And essentially, you could put it in a book. But the point is, remember, eventually someone else will release the vulnerability to the public. There's no doubt about that. Once it becomes used, once you start using it, people are going to see it. It's going to become common knowledge at that point, or at some point. Now, BugTrack, it's discovered by the security researcher and released publicly. You can release it to BugTrack, to full disclosure. You could also release the vulnerability with coordination with the vendor, so that there's a patch available once it's released to the public. Now, even if the vulnerability is released without an exploit, someone else will eventually release an exploit for it. Simple as that. Remember, patches can be reverse engineered. So anytime there's a patch, there's already efforts underway to work around that patch or to re-engineer the exploit to where it works even with the patch. If these vulnerabilities are discovered by the vendor, they will often release it with very little information. They will downplay the significance. They will want everyone to think that it's not that big of a deal. It's more often released by open source projects, so vendors will tend to try to hide the vulnerability. For example, the RPC DCOM exploit that we all used to use in our exploit demos against Windows was patched by Microsoft. When they patched it, they actually patched four other critical vulnerabilities that weren't related, that they never bothered to even tell anyone they discovered. So, everybody that was using Windows at the time was kind of out there using the product without realizing or without knowing that there were these huge issues with it. Now, there is a disclosure debate. You could release the product full disclosure, maybe inform the vendor beforehand, maybe not. Or you could do a responsible disclosure. And there is a debate around these two. So essentially, the full disclosure, people say, look, if we release it full disclosure, that at least means that instantly everyone in the world knows about this vulnerability. So even if they can't patch it, they can turn off the service if they don't need it, or they could block access to that service at the firewall. There's all kinds of mitigating things they can do until a patch is available. But the main point is at least they know that they're vulnerable, so they can, look out for it. The responsible disclosure, people say, well, but if you release it to the public like that, the bad guys are simply going to, exploit it in the wild until there's a patch. So releasing it publicly is irresponsible. And it means that people are not going to get exploited that might not have, because you've made this vulnerability in this exploit public. So two different thought processes there, whether or not you should release it full disclosure or responsible disclosure. So with the vulnerability types, there's several, remotely exploitable, which is the most coveted. Remotely exploitable vulnerabilities, an example of that would be the one that you saw me exploit yesterday. All right, that's a remote exploit. A local exploit is one that you have to already be on the device, and it's primarily what we call a privilege escalation exploit. And then there's denial of service exploits, which don't give you access to a device, but it could temporarily cause a device to be inaccessible, unresponsive, that type of thing. Of course, we have information leakage vulnerabilities, which might not give you access to the device or allow you to take it down, but it will leak information about the device. There's encryption flaws, there's implementation flaws, there's configuration and human errors, and many, many other different types of vulnerabilities that are out there. So with remotely exploitable vulnerabilities, they can be exploited without any legitimate access to a target, which means I don't need to already have a credential to get onto that device to be able to take advantage of this vulnerability. This is the most serious kind. You can usually identify these because in the public world, they'll be notated with things like allows remote code execution, or on the vulnerability rating matrix, they'll be rated as probably a 10 or higher. And that's kind of how you can know it's a remote exploit, most likely. There's also locally exploitable vulnerabilities. They require the attacker to have existing legitimate access to the target. Legitimate access can be achieved in any manner, such as using a remote exploit. The locals are often used after a remote exploit. Locals are often ignored, and system users think, the systems are bulletproof, so the local exploits are not as often patched as the remote ones are. So because of that, we're able to exploit them in a slightly different way, once we get inside. With denial of service, the vulnerabilities allow the attacker to impact the availability of the system. These could be local or remote. There's resource exhaustion ones. There's ones that allow an arbitrary crash. And there's the ones that are we call distributed denial of service. So one way to differentiate distributed from regular denial of service is if I were flooding Daniel's machine with traffic from my machine, that would be a denial of service. But if I were flooding Daniel's machine with traffic from thousands of machines spread out across the internet, that would be a distributed denial of service. And that's one way that you can think about the difference between those. With information leakage vulnerabilities, they allow the attacker to gather sensitive or potentially damaging information. The information can be leaked and be used to set up other attacks. And they're primarily used as like pivot points or information gathering points.